Ram Krishna Radhe Namo Shri Gurave Namo Shri Gurave Namo Shri Gurave Namo 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 Shri Gurave Namo Shri Gurave Namo Shri Gurave Namo Namo Jai Jai Ram Krishna Sharanam Ram Krishna Sharanam Ram Krishna Sharanam Sharane Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna Jaya Jaya Ram Krishna Sharanam Ram Krishna Sharanam Ram Krishna Sharanam Sharane Ram Krishna Sharanam Ram Krishna Sharanam Ram Krishna Sharanam Sharane.
Om Yo Brahmanam Vidadhati Purvam Yo Vai Vedangscha Prahinoti Tasmai Tam Hadevam Atma Buddhi Prakasham Mumukshurvai Sharanamaham Prapadye. We who seek liberation take refuge in that luminous being who illumines the hearts of all, who is the creator of the Creator himself, and who delivered to the Creator the infinite spiritual knowledge known as Veda. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat. Om peace, peace, peace be unto us all. So today I want to speak on the science of mantra, and see how it goes today. I scheduled for next week the practice of the mantra, but if I cover the topic sufficiently today, then we'll do that. If I don't, then I'll continue the topic next time. Each talk will be self-contained. I don't like, for Sunday talks, I don't like to give a series where people can't come into the middle of a series, but we'll see. Either this will be dealt with today or today and next week. In that case, I'll speak on in the case that I don't finish the topic today, then and continue next week, then the practice of the mantra I'll do in March. So, first, what is sound? If you speak a lot, if you have to give talks a lot, you eventually discover yourself, sometimes before others discover it and sometimes after they discover it. You find that there's sort of a way that you proceed with a talk. And so I found, after having given years' worths of talks, that I often start with a simple question, like what is sound, where we seem to know the answer to the question, but where the answer is much, much deeper than we thought. We have to go much deeper to find an answer, or to begin to answer the question. So what is sound? Well, from a purely scientific standpoint, a sound is a vibration through a medium to which the ear is sensitive. For instance, the sound of my voice is coming through the air, through the medium of air. And but we can hear in water also. If we're Diving underwater, we can hear sounds there also. So the waves are carried through the water. The sound waves are carried through water. And our own voice sounds different to us from what it sounds to other people, because our voice is carried through the bones of our head as well. It's an experience all of us have had, where the first time you hear your own voice recorded, you're shocked. You said, that can't be me. That doesn't sound like me at all. And that's because we hear partly through the air, but largely through the bones of the head. And through the sinuses and everything, there's a complex reverberation that we hear when we hear our own voice. And so it always shocks us. I was in junior high school the first time I heard my voice recorded, and I just couldn't believe it. I didn't think it, I thought, like most of us, it suddenly sounds awful. Our voice inside our head sounds so much richer than we hear it recorded as other people hear it. So sound, in a simple scientific sense, is just a simple vibration that is carried through a medium to which the ear is sensitive. Of course, there are sounds that are too high a frequency for us to hear, and sounds that are too low a frequency for us to hear. So just as with light, there's ultraviolet and infrared light, but visible light is in between the infrared and the ultraviolet. And so there's sound that goes too high, that a dog, however, can hear. Dogs can hear sounds that we can't hear, because they can hear much higher sounds than we can hear. And perhaps, I haven't studied this, so I don't know, but it seems likely that whales can hear sounds much lower than our ear can detect, because if you hear recordings of the whale speech, it's in a very low register. And so it may be that their voice goes lower than what our ear can hear. I don't know about that, but it's quite possible. So sound is a vibration that the ear is sensitive to, that the ear hears. But is that all there is to sound? Is sound just a vibration? No, it can't be just that, because we have mental sound as well. If I'm not speaking, just sitting here thinking, I'm thinking in sounds. I'm thinking in mental sounds. There's no physical vibration. Now you may say, well, Swami, they are brain waves. Yes, but not sound vibrations. There are brain waves associated with thought processes. But I'm not hearing brain waves. The brain is producing waves and then they're coming into my ear and I'm hearing them. No. And yet there is mental sound. And so if there's mental sound, then what's the connection between mental sound and physical sound? We call both sound. And to ourselves, if we don't think about it deeply, they sound the same. Whether I say dog or I think, and I just thought the word dog, it sounds the same to me, but actually they're not the same. One is a physical sound and the other is mental. So there are deeper sounds, mental sounds, and then there are sounds which are still deeper than mental sounds. For instance, it's known in the yoga texts and by people who have had the experience that in very deep meditation, one can hear the sound of Om. But it's not heard even as a mental sound. It's heard as something higher than a mental sound, and yet it's recognized as sound. The mantras that are given in traditions, like the mantras given in our tradition, the Ramakrishna tradition, were all realized by Sri Ramakrishna in very deep states of consciousness, where he had gone beyond the limits of the ordinary mind. And heard these transcendental sounds, and the mantras that we say are the closest that we can capture in human speech to a sound which is beyond physical vibration and beyond even the mental sounds that we hear. So sound is much more complex than we generally think. One of our problems today is that we have a scientific bias. Now, science worked for many centuries to overcome religious and philosophical biases. There were and are still religious biases and philosophical biases that science has worked hard to free itself from, only to find that in science itself we have biases also. For instance, the idea in the West that you find inherited from the Jewish Bible, the Torah, into Christianity. The Jews don't have as much problem with it as Christians, some Christians do, fundamentalist Christians. The idea of 6 days of creation, that the world was created in 6 days. And there was the Bishop of Ulster in Northern Ireland, I forget his name, but back 300 years or 250 years, 300 years or so ago, he went through the Bible, the Old Testament, and calculated according to the generations of people that the Bible told about, because the Bible really is a Purana, which tells history. Mythological history, but still history. He calculated that the world was created a little over 5,000 years ago. And so those who believe that even now, people who believe that even now, then they discount evolution. That evolution tends to, or evolution says that there was this process by which life emerged from matter. And fundamentalists say that no, God created life, and he created life. I forget whether it's the 4th or 5th day or which day it was he created life, but life was created by God, and God created everything at once. And such people who believe that go even so far as to say that God scattered dinosaur bones at the time of creation around the world in order to confound the minds of atheistic scientists. As if God had nothing better to do than to play tricks on atheistic scientists because they were so bad that they were atheists. So he was going to play tricks on them by creating dinosaur bones and throwing them around to make them think that the world was older than it is. It's that type of bias. Another bias, of course, that the earth is the center of the universe. That was a very strongly held bias in the West, in Christendom. That's why Galileo and other scientists had trouble with the church, because they began to remove the earth from its central place in the universe. Even though they were religious people like Galileo and Copernicus and others, but still they got into trouble and their theories were repudiated because they went against this religious bias. And so, back to the topic, we have scientific biases, that is that everything comes from matter. Out of matter, you get complex enough combinations of matter through random processes, just random processes, and suddenly you get the right combinations so that you have life. And then life begins by random processes to develop and become more and more complex, and then you get to the point where you find the signs of consciousness. And then consciousness gets more and more complex until in the human being, you find that the consciousness becomes self-reflective. You can think about your own consciousness and be aware of the fact that you are conscious and what it means to be conscious. So that is a scientific bias, that everything has come from the ground up. And so associated with that is our idea of sound. The idea that sound is just a physical vibration. And when you have mental sound, when you can think about words or think in words, or you can even think in tunes also, or you can create tunes in your head, that is just somehow the brain mimicking physical sound. And it's nothing but a mimicking of physical sound. And yet the Vedic tradition says that no, it's the other way around. The other way around, that sound comes from the ultimately subtle source, that there is Shabda Brahman, there's Brahman in its aspect as sound, and from that you get high sounds like the sound of Om, which is heard in meditation, the origin of all sounds, and then that breaks into other mantras of deities and so forth, and then that further comes down into meaning and mental sound, and then you get to physical sound. The process is the reverse of what one would think from a materialistic standpoint. So what is sound? That again is difficult to say. So I'll go into that a little more deeply. You find in all traditions, whether it's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, etc., you find that there is the idea of a divine sound. There is the idea of sacred name, which is higher than all other names of ordinary things. And again, there's a sacred source to at least some sounds. And in the Vedic tradition, there's a sacred source to sound itself, as I'll explain as we go forward. In Zen Buddhism, or Chan as it's known in China, Zen as it's more popularly known nowadays in the West. In Zen Buddhism, there's the famous question, which some of you at least have heard: what is the sound of one hand clapping? What is the sound of one hand clapping? And so that's a koan that one is to meditate on in order to take the mind beyond logical answers, because there's no logical answer to it. What is sound? As I said, sound from the physical standpoint is a vibration. And a vibration is set up how? By two things striking each other. You have to have two things striking each other to make a sound. That makes a sound. My voice is the vocal cords vibrating, because the air is hitting the vocal cords. If I'm not breathing, I can't produce a sound. I have to breathe so that the air pushes against the vocal cords and it sets up a vibration. And so all sound is produced, all sound is vibration. And vibration is set up by at least two things striking each other. But the Zen question is, what is the sound of one hand clapping by itself? Well, that is similar to the Vedic idea of the anahata dhvani, the unstruck sound. That there is the original sound of the universe, the original creative sound out of which everything has come. The mind, the body, the universe, at all levels of creation, from the highly spiritual down to the grossest physical matter. All of it has come from the anahata dhvani, the unstruck sound. Unstruck, why? Because there are no two. Two things striking together, you can't have a striking of anything unless there are two. There's a striking only if there are at least two. But what is the sound of one hand clapping? That is the striking of just one thing by itself, with no other, with one alone, one without a second. What is the sound of that? So that's the philosophical explanation behind the question, what is the sound of one hand clapping? So, sound. We have various types of sound. There's just, which is a meaningless sound, or is it a meaningless sound? And not necessarily meaningless. You understand if you hear it. What was that happened? If you're not looking and you don't know, say you didn't realize that you're the only one in the room and you didn't realize that I had come in quietly and someone's sitting and you hear something like that, you think, oh, something fell. Well, that's meaning. You hear a sound and it conveys meaning, something fell. And then you look around and see me and I'm smiling and you realize I did something. And then I do it again and you realize, oh, Swami hit the table. So even that conveys meaning. Even that conveys meaning. Even a random sound can convey meaning. That's why when we hear a sound that we don't recognize, we look around to see what happened, what caused it. That is, what's the meaning of it? Did something break? Did something happen that wasn't supposed to happen? Or maybe there was something that our aunt gave to us as a present that we can't stand. It's so ugly, so we think, I just hope that's what fell and broke. So I have a reason to tell her that I had to get rid of it. I can't get rid of it because she will feel bad, but I can't stand it and I want to get rid of it, so hopefully that's what broke. So even random sound can convey meaning. We have ugly sounds, like if someone is next door using a chainsaw to cut through something, or you hear a cacophony of sounds. There are all sorts of random sounds that are going on, just like you're at a very busy construction site where there are cranes and bulldozers and power tools and all sorts of things being run, and it's just a horrible sound. So that's one type of sound. But those are not words. Words are sounds, obviously, but spoken words are sounds. Even mental words are mental sounds. But again, from the scientific standpoint, from the scientific bias, the standpoint of materialistic science, then a word is nothing but a noise set up by the vocal organs and modified by the mouth, but it's just a sound, nothing but a sound, that we, by some random process that we don't understand yet, have assigned a meaning to. So I say dog, it's just a sound, nothing more than that. But we haven't assigned a meaning to that, but we have assigned a meaning to the equally random sound dog. And so we could come up with another name. We could do, instead of calling it a dog, we could call it Blark or Klop or something like that. We could assign that to dog, but it's just a random sound. So that's the scientific idea. The Vedic idea is that no, there's an intrinsic connection between word and its meaning. So we'll come back to that in a moment, the difference between sound and word. But what about the difference between sound, like a cacophony of sound, and what we call music? Music also is just a sound. But you can tell a huge difference between an accomplished violinist and a kid who just got their first violin and is just trying to play, and it's a horrible sound. That's one of the great tests of a parent's patience, that they put up with their children's learning to play a musical instrument. How my parents put up with my trombone when I was a kid, and the clarinet. I tried to learn clarinet, and then I played the trombone, and then they asked me in the school band to take home the sousaphone, which is this huge thing with a bell this big around, which has that huge bass tone. So I had to take that home and practice. And then I tried guitar and banjo and recorder, always trying some sort of instrument. How my parents survived that, I don't know. But there's a great difference between music, real music, and just noise. That's why we don't like noise, but we do like music. At least some type of music all of us tend to like. Maybe some types we don't like. I remember the first time when I was in San Diego, this would have been in the 1980s, I think, late 80s. First time I heard rap, I just couldn't believe it. I thought, my God, what in the world is that? Later, I got to an appreciation for it. Not that I like to listen to it, I don't. But I did come to an appreciation for it and saw that it wasn't just a noise. But then I got another shock with rap on a plane once. This would have been 1991. I was flying from Singapore to Calcutta. And so they had a promotional video on the Singapore Airlines flight going to Calcutta, a tourist video produced by India, showing modern India and what to see and do in India. And as one segment, they had Hindi rap. And that was such a shock to hear rap in Hindi. But again, all of us like some sort of music or another. Some like classical, some like pop, some like blues, some like country western, etc. Bhajans, etc. So the difference between music and ordinary sound, random sound. Music also is different from words. If you have just instrumental music, there's a difference between that and words. Words have the ability to express complex ideas. Now, music also can express ideas, but in a limited way. What music can convey very effectively, more effectively than words, is a mood. Music can express a mood much more effectively than words can. But as far as complex meaning, you can hear things like, most of you probably would not be familiar with it, but there's a famous composition by a Russian composer, composed in 1936, that you might have heard on television, because it's one of the most played symphonies, symphonic music. It's called Peter and the Wolf. So the original composition by this Prokofiev or something like that, I forget his name, something like Prokofiev, this Russian composer, it was to be played while the story of Peter, the fairy tale, children's fairy tale, Peter and the Wolf, was to be read. And if you know the story of Peter and the Wolf, even if you just hear the music, you can tell what's happening in the story. It's such a beautiful composition. It's nice to listen to, but it really tells the story in music. You can hear the wolf tiptoeing towards his prey, and the whole story, if you know the story. But if you don't know the story, you just hear music. And this music itself is nice, but you just hear music. But if you already know the story, you can hear how the music is relating the story. So music can convey meaning, but in a limited way. But what it excels at is the conveying of a mood. Swami Vivekananda said that music is the highest worship for those who understand it. That also he said, for those who understand it. Music is the highest worship for those who understand it. So we have sound, we have music, we have word, and of course you could break that down much, much further. Those are three large categories. But again, coming back to word, because words we can see are special. Words are very special because you can convey complex meaning. And so again, the conventional idea of word is that words are conveyed by conventional agreement. We all agree, English speakers, whether it's your first language or your second language, English speakers all agree that we're going to call a particular animal dog, and another particular animal we're going to call it cow, and a particular color we're going to call either red or rust or somewhere between red and orange, this color of the cloth, and this color a particular shade of orange, etc. So the usual idea is that words are assigned by convention. A group of people have agreed to make a certain sound and call particular objects by that a particular object by that particular sound. So again, the sounds that I'm making now as any speaking human being, from the physical standpoint, are nothing but sound, just like it's just that using complex vocal organs to modulate the volume and the shape of my mouth and the position of the tongue and the breath and all of that, the use of breath and all of that, to modulate to the sound so that I can produce a wide variety of sounds. But it's all just sound, just varieties of sounds, but a variety so that I can indicate a variety of things. But what about meaning? Where does meaning come from? Where does meaning come from? The meaning is not present in the vibration. If the meaning were present in the physical vibration, then you could understand Chinese. All of us could understand Chinese. We could all understand Vietnamese. We'd go to the Vietnamese market, hear the people speaking in Vietnamese, and we'd understand perfectly, because the meaning would be conveyed by the physical sound. Same with Chinese, same with Swahili, same with Dutch, same with Tibetan, etc. We could understand all languages because the meaning would be clearly conveyed by the vibration itself. But that's not the case. So where does meaning come from? Swami Vivekananda said that there was never a time when there were humans but no human language. There was never a time where there were humans and no human language. Now that's a strange statement at first, and quite contrary to the scientific bottom-up viewpoint. In fact, that's one of the things that puzzles linguists a great deal, is the development of language. And so you find that linguists like the great Noam Chomsky, he says that there must have been a long evolution of language going back to our animal past, and that there was a gradual evolution of structures in the brain for understanding and conveying language. And then in the human being, you suddenly had this ability, which very few animals have, the ability to produce a wide variety of sounds. You find it in certain birds, you find it in dolphins and whales, but dogs and many other, even mammals, what to speak of lower animals, and even most birds, can only produce a very limited range of sounds. So human beings, because of the position of the vocal cords within the throat, that itself is one of the reasons why we as humans are able to produce so many sounds, which gorillas and chimpanzees and others can't do. They don't have that ability that humans have. But Swamiji said, but anyway, Noam Chomsky and others recognizing that, they said there must have, however, been a long evolution towards the final human ability to produce language. But then how was language itself produced? That's still a great mystery, because science can't explain that, at least science as it exists today. Science does not have to be limited to its present biases, the bias that everything comes up from matter. It doesn't have to be. Science is a method. And it's just that science started with this bias that you analyze everything down into its component parts. They were interested in external nature, and so they did that and found that the material basis of material reality. And so they used that model of up from matter, the analysis of matter, to explain everything. But science doesn't have to be limited to that. It is now, but doesn't have to be. There are scientists now, especially in the realms like theoretical physics, who are trying to go beyond that limitation of science. Those who are saying the biggest question now is what is consciousness, not what is matter. But anyway, there was never a time when there was no language. Why? What is the evidence for that Swamiji said? Easy for Swamiji just to make a statement. There was never a time when there was no human language. That is, never a time with human beings when there was no human language. Well, it's easy to say for Swamiji. Throw a statement out there. Religious people have done that for thousands of years. Throw strange statements out there and just to make it a dogma. But no, Swamiji wasn't dogmatic. He was the least dogmatic of people. And he himself never said anything unless he had a reason for saying it, and a reason that he could explain to others. So in this case, I've never seen that he explains it, but it is easily understandable once you really look at the human situation. And it's why scientists have not been able to explain the origin of language. Can you think without language? Many people say, oh yes, I think without language. Well, no, you can't think without language. If you say that you think without language, it just means that your own thinking is not very transparent to you. You don't really see what you're doing when you're thinking. Yes, you can have moods and feelings without language. You can feel good or feel bad and like something or dislike something without verbalizing. But you can't really think without language. Word and idea, word and meaning, that is word just the physical sound, and the meaning conveyed by the word are inextricably connected to each other. You can't think without the use of words. So how could there be a time when there were human beings who had this brain that we have now, and yet they couldn't do anything with it. They couldn't think. They were just reactive, like a monkey is reactive. And then how would you go from that, a monkey-like state, to a state where you could talk about things? How could you communicate with others and decide that, okay, we're going to call this dog? If you had no language to begin with, no words at all, you were the first humans, and you had to communicate. How would you do it if you had no language at all? How would you start? One of the strange things you find about language when you study linguistics is that usually the older a language is, the more complex it is. Look at Sanskrit. Look at classical Sanskrit, and then look at Vedic Sanskrit, which is earlier than classical Sanskrit. Classical Sanskrit is the Sanskrit we're used to, which are most of the scriptures after the Vedas. Most of the scriptures are written in the Puranas and Itihasas, Ramayana, Mahabharata, etc., written in that. It's the language that we do puja in, etc. The language that you're used to hearing chanted, etc. But before that was Vedic Sanskrit. That is, before the time of most of the Upanishads. The Upanishads came in a transitional period where you're beginning to get something closer to classical Sanskrit. Classical Sanskrit is the Sanskrit formalized by Panini. But before that, in the early part of the Vedas, you find the language is far more complex. Now, if you study Sanskrit now, classical Sanskrit, you'll think, my God, it's so complex, extremely complex. But Vedic Sanskrit is even more complex. Classical Sanskrit has 10 conjugations of the verb. Vedic Sanskrit, I forget what it is. It's something like 21 different conjugations of the verb. And so it's much more complex than classical Sanskrit. So you would think that if language is an evolutionary process, you begin from ultimate simplicity, and you go from that to more and more complex, and by now we would have extremely complex languages. No, but you find that over time languages simplify. Some Native American languages, which aren't necessarily recent historically speaking, they may go back. They might have had many thousands of years, and probably surely have had maybe tens of thousands of years of development. But we think of the North American tribes of Native Americans, we think of them as technologically primitive. They had their own culture, which is advanced in many ways, but technologically primitive. But some of the Native American languages are so complex that they say you can't even, unless you're born into the language, you can never master it because they're so complicated. So far more complex than English. English is a greatly simplified language. Why? It may not seem simple to those who had to learn it from Hindi or Bengali or Malayalam or something. But as languages go, English is a fairly simple language, and it became simplified, as languages do, because of a long process of having to deal with foreigners. There were the Old English. If you learn Old English, you'll find it's extremely complicated, much more complicated than modern English. And you can't understand a word of it if you just go from modern English to Old English, even if you're a native speaker of English. But then there was the Norse invasion of England, northern England, where there were the Vikings who came in. And so there was the process, they conquered much of England, or the British Isles. And so through a process of simplification, foreigners not able to speak English well, gradually simplified English. Then there was the Norman conquest in 1066, when the French conquered England. And so that's why so many French words exist in English, but also it was a process of simplifying English because the English had to communicate with the French rulers. And so there was this gradual simplification of English. And so the evolutionary idea that you start from ultimate simplicity and it gets more and more complex, that's not the way language works. And so again, coming back to Swamiji's statement, there was never a time when there was no human language, when there were human beings but no human language. That's because you have to be, if there were no language, then you have to begin from zero. And how do you begin thinking from not being able to think? How do you begin communicating without being able to communicate? There had to be something, even if you say, well, they use sign languages. Well, that also had to be developed, unless you're just pointing at things. You can point at things and you can say, like, wait or back off. People will understand something from that. But then how do you get from that to complex ideas? No. So language is inextricably connected to the ability to think. And All of our actions, also another problem with thinking about a time when there was no language, all of our actions proceed from thinking. We do something because we've thought about it. In fact, one of the differences between an intelligent person and a non-intelligent person is that an intelligent person thinks first before they act, and the non-intelligent person is sort of impulsive and just does things and then gets the results later. And so but even for an impulsive person, there's some sort of thought that goes on. I've got to do it, and I'm going to do it now. And I'm not going to wait for anybody else. I'm just going to do it. I'm not going to think about it. I just want to do it. So there's even there some thinking process. And for that, there has to be words. So the origin of language is a mystery. It's not that the Vedic tradition, the Hindu tradition, explains in a scientific way the origin of language, but it does show the problems with the modern conventional scientific view of language as something that comes from the bottom up. And says that the Vedic sages realized that, again, language comes from the other direction. That language comes from spirit into the mind, and from the mind into physical manifestation. If we try to imagine the absence of language, the absence of speech, the absence of words in order to think, we find that it's impossible. So again, when the Vedic tradition says that the origin of language is far deeper. So now let me come to the nature of word according to ancient seers, because all of this pertains to the significance of mantra. So the extraordinary power of language. All primitive people are aware of that power of language. And so primitive people, so-called primitive people, which usually means technologically primitive people, or people who didn't have the ability to store knowledge in any place other than within their own minds. But such so-called primitive people all had a belief in the almost magical power of language, the magical power of language. For instance, in some communities, there was the idea that everyone's real name was always a secret, because if you gave your real name to someone, then that would give them power over you. And of course, the whole idea of witchcraft, and an idea which is in much of the black part of Tantra, that is that part of Tantra which deals with magic. So magic, witchcraft, that part of the magical part of Tantra is full of this idea of the magic of language, that by saying certain things, you can have an automatic effect, that language has the ability to produce an effect. So we can see easily the origin of that idea, because language does have a magical quality about it. I can make a sound with my throat, just again, in purely physical terms, it's just a noise I make with my throat, like that, but made with my throat, and you get angry. Because that particular noise I made, you take as an insult. I say something that you recognize as words, and you recognize it as mean words aimed at you, insulting you, and you get angry. What happened? I just made a noise with my throat, and suddenly you're angry. Or someone is weeping, they're sad about something, and I go over and I make another noise with my throat, and suddenly the person says, "Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. You've comforted me greatly." What did I do? I just made a noise with my throat. And yet, the person who is weeping suddenly feels consoled. So, again, the magical power of words. Children are aware of that. I remember so many times as a child, and I wasn't alone. It was a common childhood experience. When kids are playing, kids, of course, can be mean. And so a kid would call me a name, and I go to my mother and say, "Oh, so-and-so called me a name." And my mother would say, "But it's just a name. That's not you. That's just a name. Just brush it off. It's just a name. But as a kid, I couldn't understand that at all. No, I felt like I had the name smeared all over me. The name had deeply affected me. So such a tremendous power words have. In fact, that's something we have to learn as youth and then as adults even more, not to take people's words seriously. Because the tendency is to take words seriously. We take words seriously because words have power. And what power do words have? They have the power to convey meaning. They have the power to convey significance, meaning. So again, how does that happen? It can't be, again, from the materialistic standpoint, that it's just randomly assigning, someone made a sound and somebody decided to assign a meaning to it. You look at how complex language is, that it's unimaginable that, first of all, you couldn't have a committee of people sitting around assigning meaning to different sounds when they themselves didn't have any language. You have to start with language. You don't start with the absence of language. And so again, Swamiji said there was never a time in human history when there were people without language. So the great Sanskrit grammarians, one of the wonderful things in the Hindu tradition and the Vedic tradition is that every science was seen to be a sacred science. Whether you studied mathematics, whether you studied astronomy, whether you studied medicine, whether you studied grammar, whether you studied music, whether you studied art, everything was seen to have a divine source. And so in every science, the originator of the science is seen to have been a divine, either a rishi, who was a realized soul, or a deity. Like music comes from where? Saraswati. Comes from Saraswati. Language comes from where? From Saraswati, whose puja we just observed. I don't mean here, but we didn't have a puja for it, but we did have a puja for Saraswati yesterday in Austin that I performed. So the Sanskrit grammarians, they've said some wonderful things. Let me read a couple of short quotes from, I think this is from the Vakyapadiya of Bhartrihari, the great Sanskrit grammarian, great sage. He said, the Sanskrit grammarians say they began by investigating normal speech, like this, normal speech, and stumbled upon the word absolute, Shabda Brahman, like someone engaged in picking up straw, stumbling upon a huge diamond. So the grammarians, they wanted to analyze speech, analyze how it is that speech is structured, how it is that we talk, how it is that we convey meaning through speech. And so they began to grammatically analyze speech. But then they stumbled through that analysis of speech. They stumbled upon the absolute Brahman. Like, he says, like people sorting through straw, thinking it's just straw, and then suddenly finding in the midst of straw a huge, priceless diamond. So again, it says, taking his stand, that is a person, taking his stand on the essence of the word, lying beyond the activity of breath, lying beyond the activity of prana, actually, which doesn't mean breath, but the vital energy, lying beyond the activity of prana, resting in oneself with all sequence eliminated. I'll explain that in a moment. After having purified speech and after having rested it on the mind, after having broken its bonds and made it bond-free, after having reached the inner light, he with his knots cut becomes united with the supreme light. So here it's saying that one taking his stand on the essence of the word, that is, meditating on word. And the Sanskrit grammarian said that that could be any word. A mantra is best, but any word can be taken. But here it indicates on sacred word, like Om. And so having taken a stand on the essence of word, lying beyond the activity of the prana. That is, the prana is constantly vitalizing the body and mind. It's the prana which makes the mind active. It's the prana which makes the body active. It's the prana which unites the mind and body. So the prana is vitality. But then one, in deep meditation, one has to go beyond even the prana, where that vital activity is silenced. Then one goes to a deeper state, lying beyond the activity of prana, resting in oneself with all sequence eliminated. That is, in language, human language, there's a sequence. Even a simple word like Om, 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 Om. There's a sequence. A ma comes at the end. You begin with Om. So there's a sequence. But in sound beyond the prana, in word beyond the prana, you find in a mantra, you find that when the mind goes beyond the functioning of prana, that all sequence is illuminated. There's just the sound, united sound. There's no sequence within it. It's not ma. It's not Rama, Krishna. It's just a united sound. So resting in oneself with all sequence eliminated, after having purified speech and having rested it on the mind, after having broken its bonds and made it bond-free. That is, broken its bonds, there's physical speech and there's mental speech, but then broken the tie between speech and the mind itself, gone beyond the, that is the lower mind. After having reached the inner light through the word, that is, through the word one can reach the inner light, he with his knots cut, that is the knots of the heart cut, becomes united with the supreme light. So that's a wonderful statement. That's a statement of the power of word, that through word we can go from this to the supreme light, where all of this disappears and everything is absorbed in the unitary Brahman, which from the standpoint of sound is called Shabda Brahman. Shabda Brahman is the same Brahman. It's just that from the standpoint of sound, when we trace our way to Brahman through sound, then we get to what is called Shabda Brahman, only because we traced our way there to sound. But Shabda Brahman means Brahman. So ordinarily, language means a means of communication. I use language to communicate to you. Less obvious, but as I've already said, language also means it's the very material of thought. We can't think without language, except for the most impulsive and mood-based thoughts. But we can't think without language. It's the material of thought. It's actually the essence of thought. As Swamiji says in one place, in Bhakti Yoga, in fact, talking about mantra, he says that you cannot separate word from meaning. That the person who can separate word and meaning is an illumined, becomes an illumined soul. The separation of word and meaning is what happens here, where the grammarian talks about having made the word bond-free, freed from the bondage between sound and meaning. But so if we can do that, if we can separate sound from meaning, then we have gone long on our way towards the realization of the highest. So language is the essence of thought. And then again, as I indicated, the beginninglessness of language. If the Vedas are eternal, and Swamiji said by the Vedas, it doesn't mean the books, but the knowledge contained within the Vedas, the principles that are the highest principles which are expressed through the Vedas, if those highest principles, if that knowledge is eternal, then language is eternal, because again, the intrinsic connection between language and knowledge. So if we could trace word back to its origin, we would find all words ending in Brahman. In fact, the grammarians, Sanskrit grammarians, had another wonderful idea, many wonderful ideas, but another one of their wonderful ideas is that the real meaning of every word is what? It's only one thing, and that is Brahman. The real meaning of every word, the real meaning of dog is Brahman. The real meaning of cow is Brahman. The real meaning of dirt is Brahman. The real meaning of bad is Brahman. The real meaning of ugly is Brahman. Why? because every word is expressing something, expressing sat, expressing truth, expressing reality. The grammarian said, secondarily, dog means the animal dog. Secondarily, ugly means the quality, not looking pretty and so forth. But every word, its primary meaning is Brahman itself. So every word has the ability to express divine reality itself. And so if we could trace any word back to its source, we would find that the source of every word goes back to Brahman. And so language has no beginning in time. Language is beginningless, and it comes from Shabda Brahman. And of course, today we see the great cheapening of language, terrible cheapening of language. And I don't mean just in the last couple of years, but for a long time in modern times. As I like to say, when Coca-Cola is the real thing, then you know that we're in trouble. So words are used so cheaply and so shallowly nowadays that the sense of the magic of words and the sense of the power of words is gone. When truth doesn't mean truth, when everything, nothing can, no words can be depended upon. No, as spiritual aspirants, we have to come back to the sacredness of speech and realize the importance of speech, to realize the importance of words, that a word has its value, has its significance, and shouldn't be misused. Because by doing that, we lose the power to express. We lose the power to express with refinement and subtlety. So now the connection between word and reality. Let's see, how much do I have left? No, I'll stop here and see if there are any questions, and then save the rest for next time. So next time I will continue the idea and speak about the connection between word and reality, and then mantra as a special case of words. And then in March, we'll talk about the practice of the mantra. Yes?
Maharaj, I had a question. So wasn't there a time period when pictorial sketches were used as a form of communication? Was that in addition to the spoken language, or?
I would say no. I would say that that was a way before writing in letters came. That's an extraordinary discovery or development, the ability to write in letters, which could be reused, a certain number of symbols that can be reused just to imitate the sounds that we make. But you know, in Chinese, of course, in Chinese, they don't use that system at all. They have the pictograph, they have the Chinese character, which originally the characters in Chinese, they were drawings, which gradually became formalized, so that now you can't often tell from the picture, usually you can't tell from the ideogram, the pictograph, what the meaning is. You have to learn it. But if you see the development of Chinese written language, you see that the word shui for water, that it used to look like it was wavy lines, like the waves of water. And man, even now, run, it looks like a two-legged man, like so. And big is like a big man, like that, with a strike through it. And God or heaven is that with a head on the top. And so those were originally pictures that gradually were formalized and abstracted into the character system you have now. So that's why in Chinese you can't have, now they've developed a way, but it was very difficult. It was only with modern computers that you could develop a way to type Chinese. Because to be even with a little fluency in Chinese, you have to know at least 2,000 characters, and that's not well educated. That's enough just to get by. And so 2,000 different characters, so you can't have a keyboard with 2,000 keys on it. The cave paintings found in Europe and other parts around the world where you see pictures, certainly those were meant to convey information. But there had to be language in order to conceptualize the drawing itself. So they were used in addition to language. Yes, here and then the Vriji. Yes.
I think your last thing about the Chinese, because I interact with Chinese a lot.
Yes.
In fact, I had that question when they show the human like this.
Yes.
So I told them, for a handicap, do you cut one leg or what do you sew? But that is not my question. But, the question is, if there is a fundamental origin, like something basic, so why do we need to learn a language? Like why it doesn't come automatically? Like the way the other things, some of the innate thing comes. Why we have to learn it?
Well, that's a very good question. Why do we have to learn a language? And that, since ancient times, people have wondered about that. In fact, there was a king, not of Greece, but somewhere in the Mediterranean world, I forget where. There was a king who wanted to find out what was the first language. And so he, because he was king, he could do whatever he wanted. So he had some newborn children taken just at birth, taken from the mother with no exposure to language. The mother wasn't allowed to speak to the child. The children were taken, and they were isolated from all people. And someone would come and feed them, but was not allowed to speak to them, so the children grew up never hearing any language. It was found by the time they were, I forget what age, because I heard this many, many years ago and haven't refreshed my memory on it. They found after a long time that the children had come up with their own language. And so the king had people who knew many languages come and try to figure out what language it was so he could find out what the first language was. And the closest they could find was that there were some words that sounded like some word in some language. But and so they figured that, oh, this must be the first language. But that was not a scientific study. It was just doing the best they could with primitive means. And so I found that the children did invent their own language, but again, not by sitting as children and saying ugh, and then pointing at something and deciding, oh, that's ugh, okay, then we'll call that ugh. No, it just came. And so we learn a particular, it seems, I'll present this as a theory because I can't prove it. It seems that we have to learn a human language because there are many different ways of expressing oneself. And you see the large number of human languages that have different grammatical structures. Now, linguists are interested in finding the similarities between languages. That is what unites languages, because that shows universal structures within languages. Like all languages have nouns and verbs and certain parts of speech. But then there's a vast amount of diversity, not just in vocabulary, but in grammatical structure as well. You take two languages like Sanskrit and Chinese, they're poles apart as far as their linguistic structure goes, poles apart. So we have to grow up in a community of speakers, and so in order to learn the particular language of our tribe, we have to learn a particular language to communicate with them. But it's not that the language itself would be absent if we didn't teach a particular language. There's one other thing I wanted to say on that, then I'll stop. What was that? And now I've lost the other thought. So anyway, that's basically the closest I can get to an answer. That theoretically there is the language structures within the mind, but a child has to learn a particular language in order to express itself in a way that's understandable, because of the vast diversity of ways that one could express oneself. And of course, nowadays, we couldn't possibly, and would not, hopefully, would not want to, take children from their mother at birth and isolate it from all human contact and then see what happens. That would be an extremely cruel experiment. Now, Bridgie had a question also.
Maharaj, you said that word and meaning.
Yes.
And just like we had the mantra, if we recite the mantra with word and meaning, but if there is no bhavana behind that, so can you elaborate a little bit more on bhavana? Because when we do the mantra with bhavana, I think is more effective, or the deep thinking of the behind that.
Yes. So that bhavana, the thought behind the word, and that's true. We find ourselves sometimes thinking, and we weren't even thinking. We weren't even paying attention to our own thoughts. Our random thoughts are rising in the mind, and we're not even paying attention to them. We're doing something else, and then suddenly we become aware of all of these thoughts that are rising in the mind. So it's one thing that to have a word that is the physical sound. Then there's the meaning of the word. And then the easiest way to explain the process of bhavana, the thought behind, is that we have to have attention to what we're doing. So if we're repeating the mantra, and we've all experienced this, if we repeat anything like a mantra, that you're there, om, 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 and then you're going on with om and thinking about going shopping, and I've got to go get this, and I've got to change the light bulb and all of that, om, 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 while all of that's going on. So om is going on, but the mind is thinking about other things. So no, if even that will have some effect. Even that will have some effect, but it won't have nearly as much effect. It won't have enough effect as if you have bhavana. That is, if you're thinking of the meaning, if your mind is intent on the meaning, you're aware of what it is that you're saying, why you're saying it, what the meaning is, and the purpose and the emotional content and all of that. Say if you're repeating the mantra of a deity, then along with the repetition, you're thinking of your relationship with the deity. You're thinking about the presence of the deity. So if you receive initiation in our tradition, and most traditions, but in our tradition at least, the guru will say, meditate on recite the mantra and think of its meaning. So many people come to me and ask, Maharaj, my guru told me to think about the meaning of the mantra, but I don't know what the meaning is. And that's a good question, and it's something that the guru usually doesn't realize that nobody's going to understand that, and they don't explain it. But the explanation is very simple. The meaning of the mantra doesn't mean some explanation of the mantra. The meaning means the deity itself. So the meaning of Ramakrishna's mantra is Ramakrishna himself. The meaning of Holy Mother's mantra is Holy Mother herself. The meaning of Shiva's mantra is Shiva himself. And of course, a mantra like Om Namah Shivaya, of course, that has a stateable meaning, Om, salutations to Shiva. But the real meaning of the mantra is not thinking about Om, salutations to Shiva and all of that. The real meaning is Shiva himself. And so the meaning of a mantra is the deity that the mantra pertains to. So yes, you have word, which is the sound. You have the meaning, which is embedded in the sound. But without bhavana, you don't become aware of the meaning. It's just the sound that's going on, om, 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 and you're not even thinking about the meaning. You're thinking about something else. So bhavana means putting the mind there and being aware of the meaning. So we'll stop here. Time is long up. Let me say a closing chant and then announcements. Om madhuvatartayate madhuksharanti sindhavaha madhvirnasantoshadhihi madhunaktamutoshasi madhumatparthivagum rajaha madhudyorastuna pita madhumandho vanaspatir madhumagum astu suryaha madhvirgavo bhavantunaha om madhu om madhu om madhu. For us who seek the truth, and for all the beings, may the winds blow sweetly. May the rivers flow sweetly. May the herbs yield us sweetness. Sweet be the night and the break of day. Sweet be the very dust of the earth. May the heavens pour down sweetness upon us. May the trees, lords of the forest, bear us sweetness. May the sun shed its sweetness upon us. May all the directions pour forth sweetness. Om, sweetness, sweetness, sweetness. So for announcements, we will have on Tuesday and Thursday the usual classes. Tuesday at 7:30 in the evening, the Gita class. Thursday morning at 11, the class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And so next week, unlike what is announced in the bulletin and on the website, I will speak on the continuation of the science of the mantra. And so today,